I think I could add to what Ian has said by saying that, just adding to his last comment about an increase in farm attacks and farm killings after certain policy positions are adopted. We have also found, and we have released a report about this last year, that based on a preliminary study by AfriForum, we have found that farm attacks and farm murders also tend to increase in the months following on highly reported or cases of hate speech, clear cases of hate speech by very influential politicians. We have found that there tends to be an increase in farm attacks and farm murders as a result thereof. So what I will do now is I will add to what Ian has said with some comments about farm killings, and then I will make a few comments about expropriation without compensation. So the figure that's on the screen at the moment is a combination of all of the data that has been released by the police, by the South African Police Service regarding farm murders and farm attacks. Now, Ian has already said, I think Ian has already said, we have said it earlier as well at AfriForum, that we believe that our data on farm murders is more reliable. It seems that way because we work with names that we could verify, and we have seen oftentimes that we have more names of people who have been murdered on farms than are included in the police's own data. On the other hand, we know that the police's data on farm attacks is more comprehensive than AfriForum's data. So this, as I said, this is a combination of all of the reports released by the police regarding farm attacks. As we know, in 2007, the police stopped releasing statistics about farm attacks. A policy decision was taken that they would not release any further statistics, and since that there's been 2 or 3 cases sporadically where, when senior representatives of the police spoke at certain events, they released further statistics. Also in October last year, when the Acting National Police Commissioner released the statistics for the last year, 2016 and 2017, he also said that over a time period of 21 years, there's been more than 1,700 farm murders and more than 12,245 farm attacks. Now, added to that, we know that there are 3 years in which no statistics on farm attacks and farm murders are available. So if we do the calculation and we exclude those 3 years, it boils down to an average of 680 farm attacks per year and 94 farm murders per year. Now, these are not AfriForum figures, these are the government's own figures. These are the figures of the government who's saying that AfriForum is lying about farm attacks and about farm murders. And if you calculate that, it boils down to more or less or nearly 2 farm attacks per day stretched out over a period of 18 years and 2 farm murders per week stretched out over a period of 18 years. Now, what we have seen is there's been a gradual decrease. The figures are more clearly, especially in terms of farm murders, on AfriForum's data, which I'm not going to show here. But since about 6 years ago, every year there's been an increase again in farm murders, especially in South Africa, as well as farm attacks. Now, we know the response is always, yes, but violent crime is a problem. All violent crime is a problem. And yes, all violent crime is a problem in South Africa. And the question or the accusation is, why are you complaining about so few people who are murdered, as opposed to, or considering the fact that there's been a total of 19,000 murders in South Africa last year? The problem with that accusation is that it's not considering the nature of statistics. It's not considering the size of the group that we are talking about. So yes, last year there were 19,000 murders in South Africa out of a population of 55 million people, or 56 million people. Calculating the ratio at which South African farmers are murdered is quite difficult due to a variety of reasons. But what we do find is all the available research on that indicates that farmers are being murdered disproportionately. The ratios that are available indicate that a farmer's chance of being murdered is about 3 to 4 times as high as that of the average South African, which is 34 per 100,000. We've also determined that for the ratio at which South African farmers are murdered to be normal, to use that term, that would mean that about 5 farmers would have to be murdered. If 5 farmers are murdered in a year, then that's pretty much standard in comparison to the South African average. As you know, we have already had 15 farm murders this year. Then we should also consider the fact, and this is where the statistics becomes complicated, that all victims of farm murders aren't necessarily farmers themselves. So we do believe that comparing national averages, that's been the big debate over the last few years. Comparing the ratio at which farmers are murdered to the national average is not sufficient. Why? Because we know that working with averages tends to be problematic because it includes the extreme cases. So we will, as AfriForum, be embarking on a new study, not only to look at the national averages, but to compare certain communities where farmers are being targeted to nearby urban communities. During 2016 and 2017, we found that 17.6% of the people who were murdered during farm attacks were also tortured during these attacks. We also know, despite this, that the South African government has embarked on a process of deprioritizing farm attacks. We know in 2003 the commando system was shut down. In 2007 there was a 25% increase in farm attacks, whereafter the South African Department of Police responded by saying that they would release no further statistics about farm attacks. Then in 2014 a report was released by the South African Human Rights Commission, highlighting a long list of practical steps that the South African government should be taking to prevent these attacks and these crimes from happening. To date, as far as we could determine, almost zero of those steps have been implemented. We have also found, other than the fact that farm attacks have been deprioritized, that victims of farm attacks and those campaigning for the prioritization of these attacks have been scorned and even ridiculed by senior members of the South African government. We can think of the example of Belinda van Noort, whose brother and father were murdered during farm attacks. When she wanted to present a memorandum to the Minister of Police, the Minister refused to accept the memorandum and issued a press statement saying that he thinks it's a publicity stunt and it shouldn't be taken seriously. We can also think of the case of Bernadette Hall, whose husband was murdered on a farm in front of her. When she wanted to present a memorandum, she only wanted to drop it off at reception at the police's headquarters. The police refused to do so on the instructions of the minister, and they then aggressively shoved her out of the police's headquarters. Other than that, we are extremely concerned about hate speech, the romanticizing of violence towards white farmers in particular, and stereotyping, negative stereotyping of white farmers in particular. And one such example is the case of Minister Lulu Zingwana. When she spoke in Australia on ABC, she said, "Young Afrikaner men are brought up in the Calvinist religion, believing that they own a woman, they own a child, they own everything, and therefore they can take that life because they own it." Now, this is a statement by a minister of the South African government on Australian television, and that was her explanation for racism in South Africa. We've had many other cases. Of course, there's not enough time to go through them all. But I think it's important to quote the statement by President Jacob Zuma in Parliament when he said, "Sorry, we have more rights here because we are a majority. You have fewer rights because you are a minority." Absolutely. That is how democracy works. Then we've had people saying, yes, but that's just Jacob Zuma saying this. It's not the ANC's view or the ruling party's view. And to those people, I should quote what the ANC spokesperson, Zizi Kodwa, said last year. When there were riots in Eldorado Park in Johannesburg particularly from a coloured community regarding an issue in a local school, the ANC responded saying that those people, referring to coloured people, have played an integral part in the struggle, and therefore it's important that they shouldn't feel that they have been reduced to the status of a minority group. We've also had there are many reported well-known cases by Julius Malema, the leader of the EFF, who was the person who proposed this policy. We know of him saying in 2016 that we are not calling for the slaughter of whites, at least for now. And a few weeks ago he said that white people should be happy that he's not calling for a white genocide. We believe those comments should be seen in conjunction with each other, and also the fact that we had EFF members earlier this year singing songs with the lyrics, "White man, you must die, shoot to kill the Boere." and the leadership of the EFF saying that they are proud of those members for what they've done. Then we also know that there are cases where farmers are murdered and where the murderers themselves state that they have done so because of political or because of racial motives. And there are many such examples. I will mention two. The one is the case of Knowledge Paulus Mandlazi, who murdered 5 farmers. And in court, he testified that the reason why he murdered them was because they were white, and he did it because his hateful white people made him do it. He even said for him, it wasn't something that made him feel sorry, because he was actually laughing about it in court. He said for him, killing white farmers is like going to work. Of course, we know that we did not get any reaction from the South African government. And then there's also the case of Mtutuka Chweni, who murdered a white farmer near Bloemfontein in the 90s, the early 90s. And he testified under oath that the reason why he murdered this farmer was because he was influenced by the singing of Kill the Boer, Kill the Farmer, particularly by the leadership of the ANC. I will point out the purpose of this conference, as Kali has said, is to respond to the accusation that AfriForum is lying or spreading false information. So just to go back to the issue of expropriation without compensation, I would like to point out a few issues or a few points where the South African government and the ANC in particular are in fact lying about expropriation without compensation. Firstly, we've seen that this policy is based on a very severe distortion of history. Yes, we know that there were dispossessions of black people in South Africa, but the underlying narrative is currently that all black people were dispossessed. We know that that is not true. We know that there are dozens of treaties that have proven, that can prove that, and the documents still exist, that land was bought in many cases, but the underlying narrative currently is if you are white and you own land, then by definition you are a criminal. We also had the state president going to Davos, to the World Economic Forum, saying to the international community, your investments are safe with us. And even more recently, a cabinet minister said that they want to encourage the international community to come and invest in agriculture in South Africa, and that the investments would be safe. Now, we know that the basis for a sound investment is property rights, the notion that your property or your investment would be protected. So while the state president and cabinet ministers are encouraging people to invest in South Africa and in agriculture in particular, there's a process to expropriate that property. This is dishonesty. We are also told that this policy has to be instituted so that black people can own land, while we also know that this policy is not about taking land from one community and handing it to another. This policy is about nationalization of land. It's about having the state own the land. Also, we know that this policy is based on a fraudulent land audit, a land audit that has been scrutinized and that has been found to be based on severe, inaccurate calculations in terms of the ownership of land in South Africa. We are also told that this policy would be good for the economy and it would be good for food security, or that it would, conversely, that it would be done in a manner that would not be detrimental to food security or not be detrimental to the economy. We know also that nowhere in the world has it been tried that property rights has been tampered with to the benefit of the economy, or particularly property rights in agricultural communities to the benefit of food security. That has never worked. So if the ANC or the government says this, they are actually trying to state that they will do something that has been tried repeatedly across the globe and that has never worked, and that they assume that they would be the first to succeed. Then lastly, we are told that there is a hunger for land in South Africa. We believe that there is a hunger for land, but it's mostly a hunger for urban land. All the available data indicates that there is not a hunger for agricultural land in South Africa. We know that the well-known figure that 93% of people who have taken the effort to institute land claims in South Africa, 93% of them have said that they do not want land, they would rather want money than land. Also, the Institute for Race Relations did a survey recently among South Africans, and one of the questions they asked him was, what do you think should be done to improve your life? And the amount of people who said they believe more land reform would improve their lives was 1%. I think in conclusion, the problem here is that or an underlying problem here is part of the political philosophy or ideology that we see within the South African government, where the goal is to have equality of outcome. But the notion is, if there's not equality of outcome, that can only be a result of oppression. So if white people and black people do not own land that's representative of their part of the population or their demographics, then the only reason for this can be that there is some form of oppression. That's the narrative in South Africa, and particularly being pushed by the ruling party. On the other hand, we also know that the ANC in particular, and the EFF, who's also pushing this policy, is also aggressively pushing an ideology of entitlement, an ideology of in which people are told that if you are poor, the only reason why you are poor is because someone has taken something from you. This, while we know that the education system is in a disaster, while we know that there are a lot of things that could be done to enable people or empower people to look after themselves more effectively, to create better futures for themselves, but all these ideas are swept under the carpet, while the only narrative is, if you are poor or if there's not equality of outcome, that can only be the result of oppression, and that is false.